ended up going to this Christian school. It was mostly like white folks and Asians. And I remember somebody called me a wigger. And I was like, I'd never heard that term before. Now, I've been called a white devil. I've been called like all that stuff, right? But what's up, family? Welcome to another episode of the Radical Middle Podcast, where we dive into the tension and talk about the things that you wish your church talked about. Today, as always, I'm here with my man, Fredy. I'm Tommy. I'm glad you guys are with us. Today, we're going to be talking about leaders of color in white spaces, but specifically, as we thought about this, and the title is Code Switching. I don't think you code switch.
Oh.
Do you? Because I go, in every situation I've ever been in with Fredy, with you,
Yeah.
you're kind of the same dude. I've never really heard you, do you code switch?
You know, as I was like thinking about this episode, I think I do. Maybe it's because you just said something, though. You just said something that leaders of colors in white spaces. And I just don't know if I've been in a ton of white spaces.
I know. Maybe that's why you know, in another episode, you're like, I love white people. I'm like, oh, well, okay.
Because I was like, I had a white host.
Yeah.
You know? Like, I just discovered that my co-host was white, you know?
I don't know I forget which episode it is, but go check out the older episodes, man. But yep, I had to drop it on Fredy that I'm predominantly white. I am mixed, but yeah, I had to let you in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I want to.
So are you code switching with me right now?
I want to say thank you. I would hope not. You know, we have some of our good friends, you know, behind the cameras, producing and filming this, and I think they'd probably call me out on it. I think my wife would call me out because she does watch these episodes, and so thank you so much, babe, for your support. But I think she would call me out on it.
But call you out on what? Because I guess that's what we're talking about. Is this wrong? Is it?
Ooh.
Right? Because
right.
Are they calling you out on what? Like, you're not being authentic. Hey, man, stop. Like, what do you mean?
Yeah, I think that's what they would be calling me out on. Like, hey, that's not you. That's not the person we know. You don't sound like Fredy. For those of you that don't know, you know, I did not know. I'm 37 years old. I did not know that this was called code switching. Until
that means that you don't do it.
That you brought it up. And so, but then when I started investigating as to why people do it, I started to think like maybe I haven't been either oppressed or have not felt that way or have been unaware of it. I just maybe I just didn't realize that I do it and there's a label for it. But for those that don't know, if you're like me and you have no idea what code switching is, code switching means that you modify one's speech, behavior, appearance to adapt to different social cultural norms. Code switching refers to the practice of shifting between different languages, dialects, or registers of language in different contexts of social situations. It is a common phenomenon in multilingual and multicultural communities, and it can serve a variety of functions, such as signaling identity, establishing social relationships, or expressing solidarity. Bro, when you brought this up, as we were thinking about, you know, episodes and stuff like that, you brought this up, and this was one of the first ones you brought up that you wanted to talk about. Do you see it as a problem? Do you see it as an issue? Because you're like, hey, I've been in spaces where people code switch, and it's just the weirdest thing. And I remember you said that. So
yeah, I mean, so I'm a big code switcher. Okay. Like and here's what's funny about this is I think the tension in code switching is the authenticity of it. There's are you really from that space? Have you received the tone or the accent or the dress or whatever it is? Like, do you occupy those spaces or like, why is it that you're code switching? So it's funny that it's the authenticity or inauthenticity that makes it like, you know, where people call you out and they're like, man, like you're like, that's not your lived experience. Right. So you just put on this, whatever the coat of whatever context you're trying to break into.
Right.
But to be real honest, it's a funny conversation because in one way, it's like, I'm like the worst at it. Like, meaning like, dude, I switch up all the time. And what I'm doing is I'm enculturating. But the reason I'm doing that is because I grew up in really diverse places.
Yeah.
So I grew up in the black community, but in my super formative years, man, like first grade to eighth grade, that was my reality.
Right.
So then what was interesting is, so that's just how we all talked. Grew up on hip hop, grew up around like, just the culture. And so I just talk like that normally. In fact, when I get emotional, that's what comes out, is like, even with my wife, like there's a raw part of me that's how I talk.
Yeah.
And then I had, God intervene in my life, whatever. I didn't go to the Muir where I was supposed to go, like just my regular public high school. I ended up, it's a longer story, but I ended up going to this Christian school. And it was mostly like white folks and Asians. And I remember somebody called me a wigger. You know what I'm saying? And I was like, I had never heard that term before. Now I've been called a white devil. I've been called a honky, like that, like all that stuff, right? But and I was like, what? And so I've had to learn how to adapt, right? And then I was going to church though, even though the church was in the middle of my city, there was a lot of like more wealthier people that went there that lived not in my city, but surrounding like spaces, right? And I always bothered me. Like you come into my city and you don't, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like it bothered me. And they were, socioeconomic level, but I had to learn that too. And then my mom wanted me to make sure, because she's had to deal with this too as a person of color who's mixed in these spaces. She's also had like, how do you adapt? How do you learn? How do you receive cultural pieces so that you can connect with people? And that, I think, for me is the core of code switching for me, where it makes it okay, would be like, how can I connect with people, continue to become as I was created to be, for the glory of God, for the sake of the gospel, those kind of things. Now, there's a whole nother side of this, which is a larger conversation, which a lot of times in the Black community, this is where this term came from. Yeah. is really like, you have your job voice and then you have your voice.
Right.
And that's a whole interesting thing too, when you think about society as a whole and racism and racial power structures, things like that. We talked about all that in another episode. And so that's interesting. And so it's like, and then there's just like, well, but there's a certain level of customer service that it's like, but that's still based on white culture and so it's an interesting space.
Yeah, there are a lot of articles in my research for this. A lot of articles pinpointed to the fact that this psychologist coined this term. It'd been around for a minute, but he coined it like in the 1940s, 1950s, because of all the Black entertainers that would like straighten their hair. Like, think about it, like James Brown, Sammy Davis Jr. They would entertain. White people would be the people who could pay for these concerts. Right? There's a lot of segregation. So whenever they would go and play for Black people, it would always be like these rundown little bars. It'd be like these really poor kept venues. But then for white people, they would fill up theaters and stuff like that. And so they felt that they needed to have this appearance that, like they couldn't do anything about the color of their skin, but they could do something about their hair. They could do something about how they dressed. And obviously they brought their culture into the type of music, but they would code switch.
It is the culture,
They would code switch so that they could be more accepted by racist white folks who would just pay to be entertained.
Right, and so then that was for the economic, right?
For economic reasons.
But I will say though, James Brown though, I mean, I'm Black and I'm proud. Like he.
But there's
you're talking about when he first started.
The argument is for Black people is when you try to for men, because you don't see that common anymore, that men would have those hairdos, like straighten their hair.
Yeah, sure.
You know what I'm saying?
There's
like,
a whole thing. Right?
Because that's what was accepted back then for any entertainer who needed to make it, because of Elvis Presley. Like he was the it person setting those trends, and so everybody wanted to have that kind of hairstyle. But the argument has been made that if Barack Obama wasn't good at code switching, he would have never become president of the United States. There are a lot of Black authors and TED speakers that bring him up as the perfect example of how you code switch perfectly. There's a Key and Peele.
Oh, bro, that is hilarious, man.
There's a Key and Peele.
Came from the bottom.
Yes, where he Barack Obama, played by Jordan Peele, is saying hi to people, and it's there's a line of people, and it's mixed white, black people, and so for every white person he says hello, he shakes their hand, but every black person he dabs them up, he gives them a hug, and it's funny because when he gets to Key, they have to tell him in his ear that he's mixed because he's so light skinned, and I thought that was so funny, etc. But they got their inspiration from the Redeem team, the 2012 Redeem team. Barack Obama goes into the basketball locker room, and there is video of him shaking the hands of the white coaches. Yeah. But when it comes to Kevin Durant, he dabs him up and he hugs him. So he does it so flawlessly. Yeah. Nobody bats nobody looks at that and says, "Oh, he code switched."
Yeah, I mean, because all you're doing is you're authentically being in these spaces, in different spaces, and I think that's good. But and I do this all the time, and I know if you know me out there, you'd be like, if you've seen me in different spaces, I'll use different words. There's even different how you phrase things, how you talk, how you dress. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And it's something I think from my identity that I've had to wrestle with through the years, and because there's a real thin line between that and co-opting,
For sure, which is what they argue that he did so well.
Yeah.
What he did well was when he would talk to a certain demographic or certain audience, he was polished because he is a polished man.
Yeah.
He did go to Ivy League. He's been in the public eye. He's been a public servant. He's a great orator. Yeah. He answers questions. He's not, like what we have recently, what we've had the last 6 years, sitting in that Oval Office. He's you ask him a question, even when he's upset, he'll answer in a very calm demeanor. But then when he is talking to a black audience, and he goes into a preacher mode, it does come authentic because that is his background as well.
I mean, it's an interesting parallel because if you go, as a politician, you're talking to your constituency, right? Or the opposition, or you're trying to move things forward. For us who are believers, I think this idea of code switching is interesting because, 1 Corinthians, I think 9, that's where Paul's talking about, to the Greeks, I became Greek, to the Jews, I'm a Jew, so there is but I always go back to the question, why are you doing it? Right. And if you're just faking, I'm just really not this person at all, or I don't have these experiences at all, I think it can be damaging to your identity, and also to disrespectful to,
for sure,
to the culture or whatever, wherever the other context. But I mean, for me, I think about this. My mom, when I was growing up, would be like, "Hey, speak this way, look this way. Hey, you need to dress nice. Look nice." We didn't have a lot of money, but she'd be like, "You need to look nice." And I'd always be like, "Why, Mom?" And she would say, "Hey, look, because when you meet somebody, right, there are these things called first impressions. It's not all about how you look. We're not we're not just about consumerism, things like that." But I was pressing her on this one time when I was a little bit older, and how you talk, how you don't be rude, all that kind of stuff. And I'm always trying to buck against, don't tell me what to do. But she was like, "Tommy, look, you're about Jesus, right? Yeah." She's like, you and your kids, when you have kids someday, you want to train them in a certain way so that people like them. You know why that is? I'm like, why? Because they're like, how are they ever going to experience God or hear the gospel from you if no one likes you? So you show up to work late, you look all ratchet, you're rude, you don't know how to interact with people, you're not cultured. Okay, so this is a whole nother thing, right? Do you know if you go to a nicer restaurant, these are the forks you got to use. Now there's a whole thing there. Do you know different things? Do you know classical music? She would make me go and go listen to orchestras too, but we also listen to hip hop, but we also, right? So So you listen to all this stuff. You listen to salsa and cumbia, and like you learn and you grow. And when I talk about people having like receiving the gifts of what people are, like that's amazing. And the more experience you have of that, I had a Japanese woman. Her name was Jenny. That was was good friends with my mom when I was growing up. She taught me really young how to use chopsticks. We go down to Little Tokyo. We go down to the toy district in LA. So you get exposed by all this stuff, and it's a gift. I can use that gift, those giftings that I received. I can use those gifts that I've received then to connect with other people. And when I can connect with other people, they enhance my life. I can speak into their life, and then I can engage more with what God's up to, because remember, God's always up to something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then if I can connect with you, and then I can always be a learner.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the issue is with a lot of code switching and stuff, is like, it's like, oh no, there's a superior language culture, whatever that is, and you got to adhere to this to even just be accepted. Right. Dude, that's like anti-God.
No, for sure. But there's a lot of it. I think that maybe for a lot of Latinos, not all Latinos are Mexican, and so for those of us that are Central American, my mom's from Guatemala, and my dad is from El Salvador. So even in those two countries, Spanish sounds different.
Oh, bro, and the slang's different. The slang's
different, and then now you like bring in Mexican, Puerto Rican, Colombians,
dude.
People from Argentina. Anyone who would be considered Latino, Hispanic, it's just all those they are so different. And I think that when you're younger and you're around different cultures, even in your own language, you learn to adapt real quick. So when you're with Salvadorians, you're able to talk like that, understand what they're saying. When you're with Mexican people, you're able to understand what they're saying. And so I think that for a lot of Latinos, maybe it's not as evident because white people or people who only speak English don't know that we are code switching even in our own language. Yeah. And so for black people, I think it's more evident because when you hear, black people will say that, how they talk and when they're around their friends and when they're around mom and then when they're around their brothers and sisters, they have to clean it up. And what they're saying is we have to speak formal English when we're working, when we're trying to, present something, when we're in school, etc. And so I think that for a lot of people who don't understand Latinos or Asians, they don't see how we code switch so easy because we're doing it in a language that you don't understand. Yeah. And so, but we're doing it all, like as you're saying this, Tommy, I'm like thinking to myself, oh man, like
so you do code switch.
So I definitely do. So I definitely do. And
but in Spanish.
But in Spanish. And it's crazy that you say this. Like last year, we rented one of our campuses to a denomination that's a Latino denomination that's very Pentecostal. And so here at Revive, we have a Spanish service, but we don't lean too much into those like charismatic roots, right? When I was there, I went to visit, to see how the campus was going. And the pastors who know me, they asked me, hey, would you say a few words? Like, you're the pastor of this campus. We'd love to introduce you. And so they introduced me. And man, like before I knew it, like I went back to my Pentecostal, like I was speaking to them with a cadence and a tonality that is not my usual self. But people who know me, who've been here at Revive with me for the last 4 years would say, no, that is you. And so which is it? Like, am I this Pentecostal fiery person, or am I this calm, collected person that manuscripts his sermons?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And
you could be both and.
So should we feel guilty for those things, bro? Like, should we feel guilty that if those Pentecostal old ladies and older men come to my Spanish service here at my church and they don't see that, they'd be like, wait, he was faking it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's all about like connection and relationship. The issue though comes for me when it's like, because you're right on the code switching thing, even within churches and within different church cultures. Mm-hmm. I do that all the time too. And the reason is because I want to connect with who I'm speaking to. Right. I want to help them grow in their understanding of God. I want to help them love God and love others like that. I'll do whatever that takes to do that. but I think you have to have a level of authenticity to it.
Yeah.
Like, where are you coming up with that? And it's always funny too. Like, there's like reels and memes about whenever, you know, if a group of white folks has that one black friend, they come, how everybody always like acquiesce. They like code switch to, hey, my brother, like, how, you know, give me some skin. Like, just really like, like, what, dude? Like, you never talk like that.
Yeah.
And you don't even have a black friend, or you don't like, so it's an interesting thing there. And then I think about my own life, and I go, but I did come from that place. But I literally have to think about it when I'm meeting people that don't know me, don't know my story. I go back and forth. Like, if I meet somebody, I was in New York, we were doing this, you know, this event, and I meet somebody else. It depends on how I'm introduced to them, the situation that we're in. Am I going to give respect to, say, maybe an African-American man, that somebody goes, oh, this is Tommy Nixon, he's the CEO of UYWI. I know in that split second, I can tell body language, all the things, right? If they're like, they look at me, this is what they see. So then we just do the normal handshake. Now, but it's split second stuff.
Yeah.
How you doing? Because part of that also is they don't know if I'm one of these like goofy, you know, white dudes that are going to be like, hey man, like, you know, but not really know what's happening. And so it's a sign of respect too.
Right.
And then usually after then we get talking, they understand a little bit more. By the end, when we say bye, man, great talk. You're right. It's different.
Yep.
So I'm constantly in that. But again, it's about connection. It's about respect. It's about honoring that other person. And I think where all this code switching goes wrong is, for those of you who are leaders of color in white spaces, it's this idea where you're like, can I authentically be me in this space? Now, for you who are leaders in that space, in some of these, maybe you're a leader who's white and you're in these spaces and you have leaders of color in your org or your church, whatever it is, you have to remember they're a gift to be received, and you want to receive as much from them. So you have to create the environment so that you can receive that gift. Because if they don't feel comfortable there, they're going to acquiesce to the cultural norms in that space so that they can be successful.
Right.
But in some ways it's not just uncomfortable, it can be extremely damaging and hurtful. And we know a ton of these stories. And so then it's just assumed that this one cultural lens is the right lens.
Right.
And what I'm trying to tell leaders is you're missing out on the gift of your staff. So maybe you're just trying to be diverse so you don't, you know, look racist or whatever. Well, then you want to receive their gifting. So they need to feel comfortable enough to then share those sides of them. I remember I had my man Lamont worked at this pretty like South Orange County church, huge church. And he was coming from the South. He would put on his office door a slang word of the week, right?
I love this story already.
And he would just put it out there, and so then people would start to understand, so that he was educating people. This is where I'm coming from.
He was leveling them up,
and I want to share my culture with you. Because you're for sure sharing your culture with me. Right. Every day, every moment of the day, I'm inundated with it. And so that was a beautiful way of just going like, oh, okay. Now, I mean, he would put some really funny stuff on, like you know, what in a church culture base and with like, you know, be like, oh, it's pretty inappropriate. Yeah. But at least they understood what it was, understood the larger culture and how do you engage it.
Yeah. Yeah, I met someone who was in a church. I was in a cohort. I was beta testing a cohort from someone, you know, and they had there was a guy there. I forget his name, but he's a black gentleman, and I think he was a little bit older than me, but he worked at a big white mega church. And one of the things that he brought up, when I think we were reading the book The Cure, and talking about the self and stuff like that. And one of the issues that he was facing was that he felt that every time he preached, he needed to polish up his language. And he felt that was so difficult for him. There is an article, if you guys want to look this up, it's on baptistnews.com, and it's the title of the article is How Code Switching Might Explain Why People Aren't Coming Back to Church. Now, this was written about a year ago, and they talked about how during the pandemic, all these pastors who needed to portray a certain image of cleanliness and polish self and perfectionism, they didn't have to do that anymore. And, being on camera gave them a level of freedom to just be able to communicate authentically the way they are. And people understood that the reason they were burnt out was because they had to code switch every single week they were around people. And so for a lot of pastors, like you said, bro, there was this inauthenticity to the way they portrayed themselves. And so once the pandemic came and they couldn't be in front of people, they couldn't preach to people, they had to face their true self, and they just realized that they were so burnt out. And I think that the authenticity needs to be modeled first by leaders. And so, I mean, Tommy, there are Latinos, there are white people, there are black people, there are Asians, and then, the spectrum of all different races and cultures where they are the minority in spaces. So, for example, we had an episode where we talked about, white people in spaces, in urban spaces, because they exist, and the guilt that they feel because they are white and they don't want to be labeled as the white savior and have this complex, etc., because that is something that people impose on white people. But then code switching, they might be tempted to feel like, okay, I need to be urban. I need to be about the people. I need to be about the hood. I need to be about the places I'm at. And then so they start to lose, what they bring to the table. So, man, can you talk about, being free from even that aspect? Like, I'm not trying to say, because I do feel that language in black communities and in Latino communities is not a matter of not being educated. It's a matter of just culture. And so when I've heard black people tell other black people, hey, you sound white.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know what they're trying to say is like, you're talking proper.
Yeah, you sold out. Yeah.
And so like there's this guilt that people feel for having a good lexicon, like, using big words. Like, I remember people would get mad and be like, why are you using big words all of a sudden? You go to college, all of a sudden.
You better than me? Yeah.
Yeah, so can we just free some of those people that do feel like, hey, I'm called to be a good orator, polished, formal, educated. Is there a semblance of like, this is who I am? Or, man, like, no, your roots are here, so stay there.
Yeah, but part of it I look at is you should be evolving, because you want to continue to grow to become who you were created to be, to bring glory to God. And you start off as a baby, and you learn all those things. And if you grew up somewhere else, you'd learn a whole bunch of different things. Like culture and ethnicity and all that it's really important, but it's also the context that you're shaped in. And so, and all that can be used for the glory of God. So if I'm continuing to evolve, if I just stop and I'm just like, nope, this is just how I am, like, you got to deal with it. I remember one time I was with Jose Rodriguez. Now, Jose, he's like Native American. He's Mexican, I believe. He's mixed with a couple things, but he's Latino. But he grew up in the black community, and he's rooted in the black community today and the black church. And I remember I was on a trip with him, and we were at an airport at a Bojangles, like chicken restaurant. Okay. And I think we were like in like Carolina or something, like the Carolinas. And I went up, and everybody behind the counter were all African American. And I go up, and the lady taking my order had a real country accent. Like, I mean, yeah, like it was thick, right? You know, and it sounded a certain way. And I remember walking away from that, you know, got the chicken, whatever, left with Jose, and Jose's like, man, I used to talk like that. And I go, oh, okay. Like, and he's like, but you just sound ignorant. You know what I mean? Like I can talk like that, but it's like when you're in an engagement like that, he's just, and so he was sharing with me where he's like, I had to learn how to not talk like that so I could connect with more people and do what God has called me to do. Okay, interesting. And you could get into all these things, right? But if you stop evolving and stop growing, right, then you're limiting what God is going to do in and through you. You know, you have less tools to engage in what God's doing. You have less tools to connect with people, to share the love of Christ, to learn from others, honestly, too, right? And that really helps. And when you jump into that tension, that helps change the world. And I think that's the kind of stuff for me that I'm like, that's why I take on all this, but it's a thin line, you know, it's a thin line to be like, why are you doing it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. For me, I think even, so like Filipino, right? That's my quarter ethnicity, Filipino. But that can get thrown into a larger kind of like Pacific Islander kind of realm. Mm-hmm. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
My grandfather came through Hawaii, you know, went into Portland. And so I get to go to Hawaii, you know, and I find myself slipping into, like, you use certain words there, and you because I always have been trying to culturate into certain spaces. But the reality is I didn't grow up on the islands. I don't speak Pidgin, right? I know some Pidgin phrases. I could be like that. So I always wrestle with, too. I'm like, oh, like, should I... Yeah, how do I want to engage in this? And there's been times in Hawaii where people are like, oh, I thought you were a local boy, you know, or whatever. And I'm like, even looking like this, right? Because you can put on those things and you can interact in a certain way. But then there's also like, you're stepping over the line.
Right.
Because you're trying to claim something that you're really not. And I'm not. I'm not from Hawaii. I'm not Hawaiian. I didn't grow up there. I didn't, you know, like, and it's a very distinct culture. So you just have to be honest with that. And usually when you're honest and authentic, people will receive you as that. Now, here's the other side of that. If you're someone who's white but that you don't come from the urban space, but God's called you in an urban space, do you just go, no, I'm just being authentic, so you always stay white and culturally? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I'm just gonna wear Dockers every day and
yeah
plaid shirts
that
are tucked in, and you know what I mean, like these, like, you know, are you never going to connect with people using? So there's also a space there too. If you're like, nah, this is authentically me, but you're never gonna grow in it. It's disrespectful because you're never receiving the giftings of those around you and connecting.
Right.
So. But it's a real hard. There's not like a 1 through 10 like step on how do you do this.
Yeah,
I happen to do it pretty well.
Yeah,
right. But there's also things where I think about it all the time, and okay, how am I going to do this, right? And even when you don't authentically come from the space, or you're not fully, when you're mixed or whatever the case may be, it's hard because then people, like, you start over with every single interaction.
For sure.
It's hard.
And that does lead to burnout, as that article was saying. Like, so Tommy, like, let's say, you know, and I just want to say, I want to give a quick shout out to every single one of you that have subscribed to the podcast. If you're listening to this for the first time, please leave a review. Let us know in the comments section, if you're watching on YouTube, what you think, if you've witnessed code switching. But we do have an audience that's national. So there are some people, maybe like Jose, that do come from country, you know, places, like, you know, or people from the South, or people from just like very rural communities where even their English accents are just all over the place. Like, you know, we can't even mimic them. If they were to like interview for a job, somewhere, because usually that's where code switching happens, when you need
Oh,
to
yeah,
interview,
yeah.
you know. What's the play, bro? Like, is the play like, hey, you know what? I'm going to make sure to get rid of my countryness or my ruralness because I need to be employed. I need to get this ministry job, etc. What's the play here?
I mean, I think the play is, what's your vision? What are you trying to accomplish? Now, for us who are Christ followers, we know, or we should know, man, I'm here to make disciples. I'm here to glorify God. I'm here. So if God's like, I'm going to go try to get this job or whatever. Like, what's your vision? If your vision is you have a certain vision, you want to make a certain amount of money, there are barriers that are not godly in this world that you have to contend and deal with.
Right.
And you can be like upset about it. You could be upset about it and just be in a corner somewhere and just be like, oh man, kind of victim mentality. You can do your own thing and change the system. Right. And we see a ton of that. So I love this next generation. They're just going outside of all types of lines. Like, oh, well, I don't want to work that kind of normal job, so I'm going to be a creator. I'm going to be a content creator. I'm going to do all this stuff. It's awesome. You could change the system, or you can challenge. You can play along, get in the inside, and challenge the system from the inside. Or you can just go, nope, that's the system I want to be in, and that's fine. I think that's damaging, right? But so to me, the play there is, I don't know, what is it that you're trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
But I do think, so specifically though, in churches and in Christian nonprofits, I'll tell you that all these leaders out here, the leaders, you have to be aware and understand this idea of receiving everyone as a gift and make safe spaces for them to be fully who they are at that moment as they continue to grow. And so I think those for specifically like white leaders, like understand that there's a gifting there and you want to be curious and receive that. And for leaders of color who are in white spaces, you have to wrestle with every day, hey, I want to make sure that I'm also showing up and being the gift. What's hard about that is sometimes you're giving the gift to who you are, your culture, your language, you're sharing all that. You're sharing you got to be brave and courageous to share your perspective. And a lot of times it's not received. And that's, I think, the tragedy. But for you to have to code switch and live in this false reality all the time, I don't think that's God honoring either.
No, it isn't. It definitely isn't, man. You know, there's you won't see a disappointment, man. And I'm going to confess this. You won't see a disappointment growing up in a home with a strong male presence in my dad, that, you know, his voice to me, like if I thought, okay, God's going to speak to me, you'd have my dad's voice.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And then growing around other Latino, my tios, being strong personality, you will not feel disappointment like you will feel when they talk to you a certain way, but then their boss calls them on the phone.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it's like, they're so polite.
Oh yeah.
They change the tone of their voice, and you're like, you hear it for the first time as a kid. You're like, what the heck is that?
Yeah.
And it's just like, you know, it's so then you tell yourself like, hey, I'm not going to do that. That's it. Dad, you don't sound like that. Mom, you don't sound like that.
Yeah.
You know, like, Theo, you don't sound like that. That's not how you talk. Like, and that's something you carry with you as you're growing up. But then you see the necessity, as you get older, you see the necessity of it. There's an argument to be made that, you know, Sandra Bland was pulled over because she had it was a signal that wasn't working in her car. She got pulled over, and because she was so upset that the officer had pulled her over and was being so aggressive and hostile because she had a burnt out turn signal. A lot of people in the black community said if she'd had only code switched and not been black, she could have probably survived. She was just so upset.
Yeah. And
she sounded like my friends would be like, yeah, she sounded like every sister, every black mom, every black grandma who's in that agitated space. And so they're like, people make the argument like, has she only code switched? And that's so unfortunate that for a lot of black people, they are told, hey, if you get pulled over, you need to code switch. If you're listening to a certain type of music,
save your life.
You need to turn it off. You need to speak proper. You need to make sure that the officer does not misunderstand. So like, in like there's situations where like, man, if code switching needs to change your life. There's a TED Talk where some woman talks about that. The police came to her house because a neighbor called and said that home was being invaded, and she said that because she was able to articulate the fact that this was her property, she wasn't shot. But she's like, but what if I look like a thug?
Yeah.
And she said, and when I say thug, whatever that image is that came to your mind is probably what the police officers would deem probably a criminal, probably a suspect in this. And so there is points where like code switching, could even save your life. Speak to the dynamic of the fact that we still live in a world where people have to code switch in certain situations, bro.
Yeah.
To just save their lives, man. And that is such an unfortunate thing that for a lot of you urban youth workers, you work in spaces like this, and when another black kid gets shot, when another black male gets shot, when black people are being shot by the police, because we know black on black crime happens, brown on brown happens. When we're going to talk about those things probably in another episode, but specifically in those situations, a lot of our urban youth leaders will tell their young people, hey, when you get pulled over, they like tell them legitimately like code switch. Well, is that what should be the advice to young people who are urban, who are minorities, in those situations, because they could become life or death, unfortunately?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what I'm saying is there's a system here, and there's a white power structure that we need to continue to fight against. And so, because that's ridiculous. You get murdered because of the way you talk. Like that, you know what I mean? Like that's evil and sinful. And so on kind of the spectrum of all this conversation of like code switching and things like that. One, again, we want to survive. You want to survive, mm-hmm. but you want to figure out ways to continue to chip away at that system because it's not right?
Yeah.
And it's wrong. But in those moments, do you need to survive? But do we just sit around and just go, hey, man, that's just how it is? No, you got to fight against that. It's ungodly. It's something that we have to fight for. It's that's the kind of justice like on earth that we need to help usher in to show that's not godly. That is an evil system that needs to be pressed against. And you know who should be leading that? Is believers. Like that's what bothers me about in the justice space, because I'm like, you have all these believers that are like denying the pain and suffering of like whole groups of people. Like, so for our African American brothers and sisters, for our Latino brothers and sisters, for our Asian American and Asian brothers and sisters, for humanity, made in the image of God. That if you see that system and that system so entrenched that things like that happen, we got to bring heaven to earth. Like that's so when we pray the Lord's Prayer, that your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Like that's why this stuff's so important. So I think, there's the tension between, there's a reality that I live in right now, and there are rules and man-made things that I've got to deal with right now. But I've got to be conscious enough and aware enough to be like, okay, and and have the wisdom enough to know how to play that game, when to code switch, how to push into these whack, and evil systems, and how do I change them? Because if it's like, well, this is what it is, my kids are gonna have to do it, your kids are gonna have to do it, like the systems that. Like, that's what I don't get. We have to change these systems. So we have to be courageous in that. And that's where I'm like, so there is no like black or white. Like, nah, man, I'm going to be me all 100% of the time. This is just how I am. It's like, oh, okay. And then be like, man, how come I can't get a job? How come I can't?
Exactly.
You can blame everybody. And I'm just going, look, the system is messed up. But are you really just going to be a martyr to that system because you refuse that? just for the principle of it, okay. But then you don't actually become all you were created to be. So that's the tension for me. So part of me is always going, that's where our dependence on God is so important, and our wisdom, and continue to go to God and go, how do I do this? How should I share this? How can I be me? Like, you can do nothing apart from Christ, and that includes being who you were created to be.
Tommy.
And so the conversation is so much deeper than all this, because we have to figure, that's the radical middle I'm talking about. We have to dialogue around this to figure out, how do you actually do this?
Yeah.
Because everybody's in different places. They're in different seasons of their life. And you need people in your life, like you said, like your wife, your others, that will call you out when you're like, oh, like,
yeah,
why are you doing that? So
I guess, bro, like I really appreciate, as we're gonna close, I just kind of want to sit in this tension for a bit, because I know it's triggering as we bring up these names for some people, and then we always have one person or two who's like always like, yeah, bro, but they should have just like acquiesced, they should have just like, it's like you always have someone who doesn't see the injustices. And I love that you're bringing it to light, Tommy, because this is a reality, a huge argument. The Trayvon Martin case was studied by so many people in law schools, and a sentiment that ran across a lot of people who were so in tune with that case were the fact that if Trayvon's cousin, I believe, code switched properly on the stand, George Zimmerman would not have walked away free. The defense team made her sound uneducated. They made her repeat things like, oh, I don't understand what you're saying. Like, and so like people kept going over her testimony, etc., because she stayed true to her culture and the way they talk. Yeah. And so when you talk about this, like, but people say like, but if you would have just listened to the details of her testimony, because she was trying to talk about the character of Trayvon, you would have seen like, hey, like there's no way he posed a threat to George Zimmerman. Yeah. And so as we talk about these things, how can we be praying, bro, for people who like, to them, even justice, life and death, justice, getting a job, just getting ahead in life. Like, you are forced to code switch. Like, it's not your usual self. How do we pray through that? How do we ask God for wisdom to say, Lord, I have to be on a stand in front of people who like are supposed to be a jury of our peers. Yeah. And because if they were a jury of the peers, they would have understood what she was trying to say.
Oh man, that's a good point, dude. I mean, like, yeah.
Like,
and
they didn't.
That's the problem.
There was no justice for Trayvon. And so please help us understand, how should we be praying as we close this? Like, how should we be praying through, Lord, keep us in the radical middle space where code switching isn't for us to get ahead, but more so like for us to cause impact.
I mean, I think that's it right there. I also just think it's such a big conversation and so intricate and deep that I'm not sure. Just to be real, I think this kind of conversation is what we start with. We have to talk about it, and we have to like wrestle with it. We have to come, the middle again is not centrist. It's like the middle is a place of dialogue that we wrestle with the truth, and we wrestle with wisdom to go like, how can we do that? So most of it for me is, how do we see the most good happen for the kingdom of God? So in that space, even that specific, the Trayvon Martin case, if the most good would have been justice for Trayvon, and that didn't happen. And so then it's just like, okay, do we put it all on the shoulders of his cousin? No, there's a full on system there that is against, right? So, but you go, man, in that moment, sure, that would have been great, right? And maybe justice would have been done. It didn't. And so in those spaces, we really just have to wrestle with, man, what do we need to do to see the kingdom of God be experienced? And so in that, I think there's a lot of wrestling there. And everybody wants to make these kind of issues black and white. You're either like, no, I'm just going to be who I'm going to be, boom, or no, I'm going to have to speak, I'm going to have to acquiesce and be someone that I'm not. Like, those aren't our only choices.
Right.
What we need to do is in the space, in the tension between those two things, is to wrestle with, who am I? And I have to go back to scripture. I go back to truth. I have to go back to Christ to become who I was created to be, and then challenge the systems that stop me, especially in the church, that stop me from being that person. Because that's stopping glory coming to God. And that, for me, that's where I'm like, yeah, that's where I think about this stuff a lot deeper than should I code switch or not. It's like, should you be and continue to become the person God created you to be? Because you're a gift. The world needs to receive you. And that gift comes from God. And we all want to experience that more.
Yeah.
Except you have systems in the church and our world that stop that. Well, then if that stops that, then can we fix those? And that's why I'm a proponent for justice. Like, that stuff is good.
Yeah.
So if all these people are going, I can't authentically be who God created me to be, and we have to also understand, what does that mean? How does that work out? What does that mean through the lens of scripture? All those kind of things. Then we're losing out on everything that we could receive from them, our understanding of God. Because if they're made in his image, then I want to know more about who God is, right? We're losing all that. So it's vitally important in that. So when you pray into that, it's more about praying into the gift that God would give you wisdom, I think, is the prayer that I would ask for.
That's good. Wisdom
on how do you take that journey and how do you understand it? And are you actually growing in it? It's an ugly attitude just to be like, this just who I am. And I get triggered by that because I think things in my family and people that I love would use that phrase to just continue to not do what they needed to do, be the person they were created to be, and be the person that provided for the rest of us and cared for us.
Right.
It was like, sorry, that's just the way I am.
Right.
Oh, okay, so you're just a jerk? Well, change. And the only way you can change and have power over sin is through Christ.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Thank you for that. This is like you said, this is a lot deeper, and I
man.
really appreciate it because to be frank, like I don't have an answer too. So I think, here at the Radical Middle, we start the conversation. We want you to continue it, and maybe you don't know, so maybe we could all pray together. But maybe you do know. Maybe you do know what the answer is here. Maybe you do know what the play call is here. We want to hear from you. We want to learn from you because this is a dialogue, and so we would love for you to talk to your youth about this. Talk to your organizations about this. Talk to your staff about this. We're bringing up the conversations that you wish your church would talk about. So don't just hear it. Go ahead and talk about it. Start the dialogue. Continue the dialogue wherever you are, because this is what the Radical Middle is. We don't want this to be a one-way conversation. We want this to be a two-way conversation. We want to hear from you. I also want to give a shout out to every single person who listens to the podcast and will take a screenshot and will tag Tommy or myself or UYWI. We are so grateful that you are supporting what we are doing here. This isn't easy. Like, let me tell you, like, this is not easy to sit down and have these conversations. As much as this is fun, this is a responsibility also to be able to do this well, because we're shepherding a conversation that churches aren't having. And so we want to be bold enough to be able to do that. But in order to do it well, we definitely need your prayers and your support. So please, if you have not left a rating or a review wherever you listen to podcasts, drop one today. Please, 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 please. I'm almost going to beg, but please, 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 please go ahead and do that. Until next time, peace.